Hey Flight Test friends, in this segment we're going to be covering nose construction. Not this nose, this nose. Noses come in all shapes and sizes. We're going to be looking at some simple examples and some more complex ones. Let's get going. For this example, we're going to be building the nose of a T-28. These four skins represent the nose of a T-28. Here we've got the tail section, and in between the tail section and the nose section, we've got a piece that bridges the two together. We will be covering that in a later video. To build the nose section, we're going to need the four skins, and we're also going to need the formers and the accessory box. We're going to begin with the formers. Let's take a look at the symbol mapping and go from there. I begun by grouping the formers together in stacks based on the markings. You can see here that I need 3 F2s. So let's get those in the correct order. I see position 1, position 3, and position 2. So I'm going to slide this one in here, and those will glue together in that order. Looks like here I need 1 F3A and 2 F3Bs. So I've got my F3A. This line indicates that's in the first position. This indicates it's in the second position and the third position. So that stack's done. And here it looks like we need an XM and 2 F1s. Get my F1s in order. I abbreviated the markings just a little bit because I wanted to make sure that all the markings were hidden once the aircraft has been put together. So our XM plate goes on the outside. All right, now that we've got our stacks in the correct order, let's glue all the formers together. Now that the formers have been glued together, let's build the accessory box. To build the accessory box, I'm simply going to remove the foam where indicated. I'm going to use the back side of my razor blade to go down the scores to make removal a little bit easier. Looks like the battery box calls out for a B fold top and bottom, so I'll do that now. I'm going to tear off a piece of tape. This will help it hold together while the glue cools. Once that's done, you can set the part off to the side, and let's start taking a look at the skins. I've got the four skins laid out. I want to make sure that they are oriented correctly. If you look here, I've got C4, C3, C2, and C1. You'll notice that they're all on one side. It would be very easy to get this part turned around. The aircraft might go together like that, but there would be gaps and it just wouldn't look quite right. So always pay special attention and ensure that the numbers are all running down one side. So let's start by looking at the symbol mapping on this part with the star. We know that anytime we see a star, that means we are going to be starting with that part. We see that we're going to remove the paper, and the circle means that we're going to be forming a complete circle. So we know that there's going to be glue involved. If you look up here, we see that C4 is underlined. Anytime we see an underlined part, that's the part that we're working on. C4 is going to go around a former. The former is the F3 former. So I've got my F3 former here, so we know that the skin is going to be attaching to that. Over here on this side, we see that it's going to be attaching to the F2 former. So we're going to set these two parts off to the side, and we'll take a quick look at the remaining parts. So taking a look at the symbol markings on our next part, we see that we're going to remove paper and that we're going to be gluing and wrapping this part a little bit at a time. The arrows here and the arrows here indicate where we will begin the gluing and wrapping process. C3, which is underlined, will be going over a former labeled F2. So we know that this part is also going to be going over this F2 former. So I'm going to set that over there, and we see here on the other end that it will be attaching to the F1 former. So that's the order we got there. So looking at our next part, we see that we're going to remove paper. It's going to be a glue and wrap, and we see that it's going to be attaching to the XM. Over here on the other side, we see that the part C2, which is the part we're looking at, will be attaching to C1, and this is going to be an edge-to-edge fit. So on one edge, it's going to be fitting over a former. On the other edge, it's going to be gluing edge-to-edge. The last part we're going to be working on, we're going to be removing paper. We're going to be gluing and wrapping. The gluing and wrapping process starts right here in the center, and it looks like C1, which is the part I'm holding, will be fitting up edge to edge with C2. Now that we've looked at all the symbol mapping, let's get started. Going back to our part with the star, we need to peel the paper and we need to form a complete shape. Before we add shape, I want to take a look at our former. You can see that most of the shape is going to be right in here and then down on our corners. So I'm going to add a little bit of shape down the middle. And once I've done that, I'm going to add some shape down here at the bottom. So I'm going to add it between my finger and thumb right there. And I'll flip it over and do the same on the other side. We don't have to be real precise. If you feel like you need to use a magic marker to help you keep track of where to add the shape, feel free to do it. Okay, that looks good. I'm going to tear off a piece of tape and have it on standby. Add glue to one side. And when I bring my edges together, I'm going to bring the edge that does not have glue over the edge that does have glue. And you can see how I'm kind of making a heart shape. And then I'm going to close it like that. That forces all the excess glue to the inside where it'll be hidden. As it's cooling down, I'm going to add a piece of tape. This will keep everything from shifting. We'll let that cool down for just a minute, then we'll add our formers. Looking at my symbol mapping, it looks like I need to insert the F3 former. Let's do that now. I'm going to make sure that the crop mark here at the bottom lines up to the seam. And I'm noticing that it's a little bit too tight. I always prefer having a slightly loose fit than a very tight fit. I'm going to pull my former out, and I'm going to take it, I'm going to press down and roll it around on the tabletop. Okay, let's try it again. That looks a little better. Now you'll notice that I have one layer of foam sticking up above this top edge. I want to make sure that that is even all the way around. Once I'm happy with position, I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to run a bead of glue where the former meets the inside of the skin. I'm going to let that cool down for just a minute, then we're going to add the F2 former. First thing I want to check is my symbol mapping. It's calling out for an F2 former. I'm confirming it here. Let's do a test fit. This one looks a little bit tight too, so let's crush the outer edge. Okay, that drops in pretty good. I'm going to pull the former out and I'm going to apply a bead of glue just inside the edge all the way around. Check my marking alignment top and bottom and push the former in until only one layer of foam is sticking up. Before the glue cools down, I'm going to make some very minor adjustments. I want to make sure that when I'm looking through this, that the two rectangles are lined up exactly the same. If one's twisted, it'll still work, but it'll be a little bit more difficult to get your accessory box in place. While that's cooling down, let's take a look at our C3 skin. We see that the C3 skin will be attaching to the F2 former. We need to peel paper, add some shape, and then we're going to be attaching this using the glue and wrap method. Just like on the previous piece, we're going to be adding a lot of shape here and then some shape down here on the corners. We can see whenever we do our glue and wrap that we need to be starting right here in the middle according to our indicator arrow. So I'm going to line up this crop mark with the crop mark on top. I'm going to bring the two edges together. That looks good. Next, I'm going to apply a bead of glue about an inch, inch and a half long, right in the middle. I'm going to hold this skin in place for a full minute and a half while the glue cools. I want to make sure that it's thoroughly cool before moving on. Once that's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to work my way from the top center all the way down to the bottom center. I'm simply going to glue a small portion at a time and work my way all the way around. I'm going to do a test fit real quick, and it looks like my seam looks really good, about to where my thumb is. So I'm going to leave my thumb there. I'm going to flip it around and add a bead of glue on top of the former. I'm going to wrap the piece around and hold it in place until the glue's had a chance to cool. Now that that's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to wrap it a little bit more and see how my fit looks. Really looks like my fit is good all the way to the bottom there. Sometimes when you're using the glue and wrap method, you can only go an inch or so at a time. Sometimes you can go 3 or 4 inches at a time. It just depends on the shape. Bring the two edges together and hold it in place. So I've got a little bit of glue squirting out there. I'm going to grab a piece of scrap and wipe that away. Now I'm going to repeat the process on the other side. Ooh, got way too much glue in there. Once the glue's had a chance to cool down, we're going to glue the skin the rest of the way. I'm only going to be applying glue to the former. I'm not going to add any glue across the seam. We'll do that on the next step. I'm going to hold this in place for a minute and a half, and then we're going to glue the seam. To glue the seam, I'm first going to line up my two edges. Once that's done, I'm going to run a piece of tape across the seam. I'm going to flip my whole assembly upside down, and I'm going to jam my glue nozzle into the seam. This is going to get glue right where it needs to go. Give the glue a full 2–2.5 minutes to cool down. Now that our seam has had a chance to cool down, let's test fit our final former. Just like always, I'm going to make sure that my crop mark is lined up to the bottom seam, and I'm going to gently push the former in. I can see that it's going to be a little bit too tight, so just like we did elsewhere, I'm going to roll it on the tabletop and crush it down just a little bit. That looks really good. You'll notice here in my test fit, the wooden XM layer is just above the skin. Make sure it's even all the way around. Our test fit looks good. Let's pull the whole stack out, and we're going to apply glue to the inside of the skin. I'm going to check alignment here at the bottom, check alignment at the top, and I want to make sure that my wooden layer is just above the skin all the way around. Okay, that looks good. I'm going to hold this in place for a couple minutes while the glue cools. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to go ahead and install the last two skins on the nose. These can be done at a later time. Once they're installed, it's very easy to damage them, so oftentimes I will make this one of the last steps I do when building an aircraft. While the glue is cooling down, let's take a moment and look at our symbol mapping. We see here that on one side, the C2 skin is going to be fitting over the XM former. On the other edge, it's going to be an edge-to-edge fit to the C1 skin. If we look down here on this end, we're going to see a bevel start, and we're going to see a bevel stop. Let's begin by removing paper. We know that this is going to be a glue and wrap, and this arrow indicates that we're going to begin the glue and wrap process right in the middle. Once I've got my paper removed, I'm going to add a bevel. You can see I'm cutting a pretty small bevel. All right, once I've done that, I'm going to add shape. Now once I've added shape, I'm going to do a test fit, and remember, we're going to be starting the glue and wrap process right where the arrow is. I'm going to line up my crop marks and I'm going to determine the fit. Make sure it looks good. All right, so I'm going to apply glue from about here to here, so it's about 1.5 inches or so. Always remember, whenever we're installing an edge-to-edge part, there will always be a little bit of overlap. Once I'm happy with my fit between the two skins, I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2 minutes. Taking your time is key when doing the glue and wrap fit. Once that's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to continue to wrap the skin, and I'm going to go about to there. That looks good. By doing it this way, I can constantly watch to make sure that this seam hasn't shifted as the glue is cooling down. This is a process that with a little bit of practice, you're going to get really, really good at. And just like before, I'm going to hold it in place while the glue cools. Let's continue to work our way around. My fit looks good all the way to the seam. So I'm going to apply glue right up to the seam. I'm going to hold this in place while it cools and then do the same thing on the other side. Just like before, I'm only applying glue to the former. I'm not going to attempt to glue the seam together. Just like before, I'm going to apply a piece of tape across the seam, flip the assembly over, and jam some glue between the two edges. And we'll set this off to the side while the glue cools down, and let's take a look at our next part. While the glue's cooling down, let's take a look at our last part. We see that we're going to be removing the paper so we can add shape. It's going to be a glue and wrap fit. We see that we're going to begin the glue and wrap here in the center. This is an edge-to-edge fit. So the C1 will be attaching to the last skin we did, which is C2. If we look down here on the other end, we're going to see a bevel start, and here on the other end, we're going to see a bevel stop. Let's start by removing the paper. Just going to cut a small bevel. Once our bevel's been cut, I'm going to add some shape. As I'm drawing the part down, I'm always rotating the part to maintain a 90-degree angle between the tabletop and the part. Just like we did on the last part, we're going to be starting right in the middle. I'm going to match up the two skins, and it looks like I'm going to be able to apply a bead of glue about 1 inch long. I'll line up my crop marks. Once that's cooled down, I'm going to continue to work my way around. Again, one thing I want to point out, the way the kits are designed, the paper on the layer we're installing will slightly overlap the paper on the part we are gluing it to. Once the glue's cooled down, I'm simply going to continue all the way around. Always remember, whenever we're installing an edge-to-edge part, there will always be a little bit of overlap. The part we're installing will always slightly overlap the part we are installing too. Now that the nose is done, I'm going to install the accessory box. Since I went ahead and installed the skins here on the front, I want to make sure that whenever I'm installing the battery box, I'm not putting pressure in a way that'll cause creases. So to prevent creases, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down a roll of tape and I'm going to drop it down. And if you look really close, the skins are just above the top of the table, so we'll be good there. Now we can press straight down with our battery box. This will make installation a lot easier. Push the battery box in until the wings make contact with the former. Once it's in place, we'll run a bead of glue on either side and a bead of glue here at the top. Give that a couple minutes to cool down. In this example, I'm going to be showing you how to build the nose of a DC-3. It's a little bit different than some of the other examples that you'll be running across. The nose of the DC-3 actually slides off in order to give access to the electronics and the battery. Let's start by taking a look at the parts. There's a couple things different that I'd like to point out. If we look at our first part here, we'll see a lot of familiar symbols. We see that up here on this end, we're going to be fitting the skin to a former, and down here, we're going to be fitting a skin to a former. But if you look here, we see the word flush fit. Normally, whenever we install formers, there's always going to be one layer of foam sticking out. Anytime you see the word flush fit along the leading edge, you will be pushing the former assembly completely in until it's flush with the edge of the skin. If we look at our next part here, we see that on one side that we will be fitting it to a former, and on the other side we'll be doing an edge-to-edge fit. If you look at this group of parts, we're also going to be doing an edge-to-edge fit. The nose is done a little bit differently. We'll get into that in a little bit. Over here we've got our formers. Let's begin with these. Go ahead and get them grouped into piles according to their markings. So let's take a look at our first stack. We see here that we're going to need one F1A and two F1Bs. We see that the F1A has an underline in the first position, so that one will be on top. We see that the F1B has an underline in the second position, that's the next one, and this one will be on the bottom. So I'm going to put those in the correct order, and let's take a look here. We see that this stack is going to be comprised of two pieces of foam, an F2A and an F2B. This underline tells us that's in the first position, and this tells us it's in the second position. We notice that there's an M. Anytime we see an M, we're going to be flipping the part around. If you're wondering about the hashtags, anytime you see a circle with a hashtag, that means we're going to be installing magnets. We'll get to that in a minute. Go ahead and glue all your formers together just like we've done in the previous steps. Going back to our part with the star, we need to peel the paper and we need to form a complete shape. Once we've got the paper torn away, let's get a game plan for adding shape. If we look at our former, it's really round on top. The edges here are fairly flat, and then we've got some corners down here at the bottom. So we're going to add the appropriate shape. I'm going to line up the center mark of my former to the center mark on the skin, and I'm going to roll it around about to here where it flattens out. Roll it the other way and do the same. And I'm going to just draw a line all the way to the back. I'm going to be adding shape between these two lines. Next, I'm going to line up the crop mark to the edge, And I'm going to put a mark about where the corner starts and about where the corner stops. So we're going to add quite a bit of shape right in there. And I can just eyeball it here on the other side. All right, let's add some shape now. I'm going to do the center of the skin first. Let's begin by lining up this bottom line to the edge of the table and then add some shape. Next, I'm going to bring this line to the edge of the table. I'll flip it around and do the same on the other side. Since I want that corner really defined, I'm going to take and carefully bend the foam. I'm being careful that I don't crinkle it in any way. Do the same on the other side. All right, that looks good. Now that I've added shape here in the middle and then shape on either corner, I am going to add just a little bit of shape on these areas too, because if you remember on the former, those edges are not completely flat. That'll be good. Now that that's done, we're going to bring our two edges together. All right, that looks good. I'm going to tear off a couple pieces of tape. I've got my tape on standby. I'm going to apply a bead of glue along one edge. And when I bring my two edges together, I'm going to come in at a slight angle. The side that does not have glue will slightly overlap the side that does have glue. You can see how I'm bringing them together at an angle, and then I'm going to let it relax a little bit so the edges are flush. All the excess glue is shooting to the inside where it'll be hidden. I'm carefully going to hold my edges together and run a piece of tape across. I'm going to apply a second piece of tape. Let's let that cool down, then we're going to add our first former. Now that the glue has had a chance to cool down, let's take a look at our symbol mapping again. It's a little bit harder to read, but we see that we are going to be installing former F2B. And if you remember, we've got this flush fit instruction, so we will be pushing the entire stack all the way down where it's flush with the edge of the skin. Let's do a test fit. You can line up the crop mark at the bottom to the seam, and I'm going to work my former in. Let's take it to the tabletop and roll it, and you can see that I'm holding it at a slight angle. The skin has a little bit of a taper, and so I'm going to create a very small bevel. All right, let's try that again. Line up my crop mark at the bottom, and that easily pushes in. Remember, it's always better to have a slightly loose fit than a fit that's too tight. All right, that looks really good. So I'm going to pull that out, and I'm going to add a bead of glue along the inner edge. I'm going to flip my assembly upside down. I'm going to hold it in place like this for a minute and a half while the glue cools. Now that the glue has had a chance to cool down, we're going to install our next former. If we look at our symbol mapping, we will see that the skin fits around the F1B former. If we look at our stack here, we have F1A and two F1Bs. Since we don't see the instructions for a flush fit, we know there will be one layer of foam sticking up once we get the former installed. Let's do our test fit. I'm going to line up the crop mark at the bottom, And just like before, we're a little tight. So I'm going to roll it around. And let's reinsert it. That fits really good. I'm going to pull that out and apply glue. I want to make sure that my F1B former is flush to the top of the skin and only my F1A former is sticking up above the skin. I want to make sure that it's even all the way around, and we'll let the glue cool down. As the glue is cooling down, let's take a look at our next skin. We see here that this skin is going to be wrapping around the F1A former that's sticking up here. We're going to peel the paper. This is going to be a glue and wrap fit, and we see that we will begin the glue and wrap process here in the middle as indicated by this arrow. Let's begin by removing the paper. Once we've got most of the paper removed, let's take a look at our former. We can see here that at the top it's going to stay pretty flat, but from this corner down to the center at the bottom there's going to be quite a bit of shape added. Let's do that now. We can see that the skin has a point here and a point here. We know that's going to be just a very gradual curve, so I'll just add just a little bit of shape between those 2 points. From here to the edge, we're going to be adding quite a bit of shape. Let's do that now. Now that we've got our shape added, we're going to glue our skin to the top of this former. We are going to begin our glue and wrap process right here in the middle. You can see where I've got a crop mark on the skin, and I'm lining it up to a crop mark there on the former. I'm going to add a bead of glue across the top of the former. Push the skin firmly up against the former. We're going to hold this in place for 2 minutes while it cools down. Be sure and double check that the crop mark on the skin is aligned to the crop mark on the former. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to glue the rest of the skin in place using our glue and wrap method. Don't worry about getting in a hurry. If you can only get an inch or so at a time, that's okay. Sometimes the foam cooperates, sometimes it doesn't. Just like we did on the last example, I'm going to push the seam closed and run a piece of tape across it. Once that's done, I'm going to jam the nose of my glue gun in between the 2 edges and fill it with glue. We'll let the glue cool down just a minute and take a look at our next skins. The next 4 skins are going to be installed exactly the same way. If we look at our symbol markings, we need to remove paper so we can add shape. This is going to be a glue and wrap. If we look over here on this side, this is going to be the starting point of the glue and wrap process. The same method for installation will be done on all 4 parts. Let's start by removing paper and adding some shape. I'm checking my indicator arrow to make sure I'm beginning the glue and wrap process at the correct spot. I'm just going to glue a little bit and work my way around. You can see that I'm carefully making my way around. I'm not getting in any hurry to do too much at a time. I only want to be gluing the pieces together where they've got a perfect fit. Just like we did on the last section, I'm going to run a piece of tape across the seam and I'm going to add a bead of glue to the inside. Once this has had a chance to cool down, we're going to do the remaining 3 sections exactly the same. If at any point in your test fit your edges are not coming together perfectly, you can always add a slight bevel to the skin you're working on. Always remember, whenever you're gluing a skin in place, you will be slightly overlapping the part you were gluing onto. If you run into an issue where it's difficult to bring the 2 edges together, you can cut a bevel along one of the edges. You can see that I'm making small adjustments to the opening of the nose. I want to make sure it's symmetrical on both sides. Give the glue plenty of time to cool, and then we're going to do the final piece of the nose. Let's take a look at our final part of the nose. You can see that it's very small and we didn't have a whole lot of real estate. If you look here, we see that C1 is going to be attaching to C2 using an edge-to-edge fit. C2, of course, was the last skin that we put on, but instead of doing a glue and wrap, we're going to be doing this part a little bit differently. If we look here, we see that we're going to peel the paper, but then we see a complete circle. Anytime we see a complete circle, we know that there's going to be glue involved in preparing this part. So what we're going to do is we're going to peel the paper, we're going to add shape, and we're going to glue the two edges together. Once the edges are glued together, we're going to take this entire piece and stick it into the opening in the front of the nose. We're going to start by removing paper. And we're going to add some shape. We're going to do the best we can. This piece inevitably is going to get a few wrinkles in it. It's a very, very small part. You can see we're having a little bit of trouble bringing the two edges together. So I'm going to add a small bevel here and a small bevel here. Now we can bring the two paper edges together. I'm going to tear off a piece of tape. I'm going to bring these two edges together and run a piece of tape across. From there, I'm going to jam the nose of a glue gun in the seam and fill it with glue. Let this cool down for a full 2.5 minutes. It'll make it much easier to install if we're not fighting glue that hasn't cooled down properly. Now that the glue's had a chance to cool down, we're going to need to adjust the opening slightly so that the nose piece will fit perfectly. So if we line it up, you can see that it's just a little bit too narrow. So what I'm going to do, using my finger, I'm going to gently pry it open side to side. I'm applying just a small amount of pressure up and down. Now when I do my test fit, that looks a lot closer. Now I've got a lot of interference from the foam here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a bevel all the way around. All right, let's check our fit again. Okay, it's looking pretty close. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a bead of glue here on the C2 skin. And once I get my glue added, I'm going to drop in the last piece. Hold this in place for a full 1.5 minutes. Make sure it has plenty of time to cool down. As I mentioned before, anytime you see a circle with a hashtag in it, we're going to be adding a magnet. Using a barbecue skewer, you can tear out the circles now. Once we've got all the cavities cleared out, I'm going to put my magnets in stacks of 2. Next, I'm going to fill my first cavity with glue. And I'm going to drop one of my stacks of magnets in. When I push it in, I want to make sure one of my magnets is sticking up. Let's do the same on the other 2. As the glue is cooling down, using a Sharpie, I'm going to put an X on each of the magnets. This is going to help me to make sure that my polarity is correct when I glue the magnets in the other piece of the foam. In this example, we're going to be looking at the T6 Texan. The reason I picked the T6 is I feel it's going to be a really good example to show the flexibility of symbol mapping with more complex shapes. So let's take a look at the parts and let's get started. Over here, I've got the skins for the nose of the T6. It's C1 through C6. Here, I've got the accessory box, and over here, I've got the formers. We're going to start this the same way as we've done in the other examples. We're going to begin by gluing the former stacks. So I've begun by putting my formers in stacks according to their markings. You can see here, I simply need 3 F5s, position 1, position 2, and position 3. This stack is ready to go. Here, I'm going to need 2 F2s and an F3. So this one's on top because of the position 1 marking, position 2 marking is next. And if we look at our F3, we've got a letter M. Anytime we see a letter M, we're going to flip it around the other way. For this one, we've got 3 F4s. Okay, we've got those in the correct order. See that we've got a bevel start and a bevel stop. So in our last stack, we need the XM mount, the F1A, and the F1B. All right, now that we've got all our formers stacked in the correct order, let's glue them together. On most models, the wooden XM former will be slightly smaller than the foam former that it will be gluing to. If the wooden XM former is slightly smaller, simply center it on the foam former you're gluing it to. Now that the formers have been glued, let's take a look at our skins. As I mentioned earlier, the skins we're going to be doing for the T6 Texan are C1 through C6. Always make sure when doing an assembly that all the numbers are running down one side. You want to make sure that you don't have one turned the opposite direction. Your kit will not go together correctly if one of the numbers is on the other side. Before we get started, let's take a really quick look at our skins. You're going to notice something about the T6 Texan. If you look here, we've got a star. And if you remember, anytime we have a star, we always start with that part. But here, we've got another star. So what do? Well, let's make this real simple. Let's break this down into 2 assemblies. I'm going to set this pile off to the side. Let's start by taking a look at our C6 skin. We see here that the former F5 is going to go on this side. We see that the F4 former is going to go on this side. And as we look at our C5, we see that it's going to wrap around the F4, and on this side it's going to wrap around the F3. Now that we've got a rough game plan for how the skins and the formers are going to fit together, let's take a look at the symbol mapping on our part that has the star. Anytime we see a star, we start with that part. We're first going to remove the paper, and then we're going to form a complete circle. If we look at the former, it's a very even shape all the way around. This one's going to be a piece of cake to add shape to. Let's begin by removing paper from our C5 skin. Once we've added our shape, we're going to bring our 2 edges together. I'm going to apply glue to one side. And when I bring the 2 edges together, I'm going to bring them together at an angle. The side that does not have glue will slightly overlap the side that doesn't have glue. And then I'm going to bring them up flush. That's going to force all the glue to the inside. I'm going to hold this in place for a couple minutes while the glue cools down. Now that that's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to check my symbol mapping one more time. I see that this skin is going to be fitting over the F3 former. I'm going to check to make sure that my crop mark and seams are lined up to the crop mark on the former. Okay, my fit looks really good. So what I'm going to do now is add a bead of glue where the skin meets the former. While that's cooling down, I'm going to check to see which former I need next. Looks like I need the F4. So taking a look at my F4 former, I see that before I do an install, I need to add a bevel. We've got a bevel start and a bevel stop. Let's add that bevel now. Now that the bevel's been cut, let's do a test fit. I'm going to line up the crop mark here at the top. And when I push it in, I want to make sure that I've got one layer of foam sticking out. Looks like I got a little bit of interference here, so I'm simply going to cut that foam away. Okay, that looks really good, huh? Let's add some glue around the edge. I'm going to hold this in place while the glue cools down. Then we'll add our next skin. Now that that's had a chance to cool down, let's take a look at our next skin. We see here that we're going to peel the paper. It's going to be attached using the glue and wrap. Here we're going to be attaching the skin to the F4 former. You'll notice here it says 12 o'clock. This is going to go on top of the nose. The seam is always at the 6 o'clock position, so we'll be putting this opposite the seam. Let's go ahead and peel the paper away. Let's add some shape. Okay, I'm going to flip my part back over. I want to make sure this is the side that goes on the F4. The arrow indicates where I'm going to start my glue and wrap process. Line my crop marks up. Right, I'm going to apply a bead of glue about 1.25 inches long across that crop mark. Just like we've done elsewhere, give this at least 2 minutes to cool down. Now that that's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to continue wrapping and then we'll glue some more. Actually, it looks like I'll be able to go all the way around. That generally doesn't happen, but I'll take it. Give this plenty of time to cool before doing the other side. All right, let's do the same on this side and do a quick test fit. And it looks like I got lucky again. My seam is coming together really nicely. Once this cools, we'll add our F5 former. Now that our skin has had a chance to cool down, let's add the F5 former. You'll notice on the F5 former that I've got a bevel start and a bevel stop. We need to add a bevel all along this edge. And if you take a look, you can see about the angle that we need to hit. What we want to do is we want to line up the crop mark on the former to the crop mark on the skin. We're going to drop our stack in until only one layer of foam is sticking up. That looks really good. Okay, we're going to pull the former out and add a bead of glue. As the glue's cooling down, I'm looking to make sure that I don't have any big gaps or bubbles. We'll hold this for a minute and a half. Once the glue's had a chance to cool down, using a razor blade, we're going to cut along the dotted lines here and here as indicated with our symbol mapping. Once that's been done, let's gather up our other skins. Before we get started, let's take a look at our first piece here. We see that there's a star, so we know we're going to be starting with this piece. We're going to be peeling away the paper so we can add shape, and we're going to be creating a closed shape. We see up here that the C4 skin, which we're looking at, will be fitting over the F2 former, which is right here. Let's begin by removing paper, adding shape, and gluing the edges together. Once that's cooled down, let's take a look at our F2 former. We see that we've got a bevel start and a bevel stop. We're going to be adding a bevel all the way around this former. Before I do my test fit, I want to check to make sure that I'm putting the correct skin over the correct former. I see here that this goes over the F2 former. I'll line up the crop mark at the top and push this down. It's not wanting to go all the way, so I'm going to pull the skin off. Instead of using a razor blade, I'm simply going to roll this on top of the table. All right, let's try it again. And you know what? One more thing I want to do is I want to peel away the excess glue here on the inside. That might be another thing that's keeping that from going on. All right, that fit looks really good. I'm happy with that. Next, I'm going to add a bead of glue all the way around where the former meets the skin. Let's give that a chance to cool, then we'll add our next former. Looking at the symbol mapping, I see that this skin is going to be fitting over the XM former. If I rotate it a little bit, you'll see that this is going to be a flush fit. We want to keep that in mind when installing the former. Let's do a test fit. I'm having a little bit of trouble pushing the former in. So I'm going to roll it on the tabletop, crush things down just a little bit. Okay, that's going to go in no problem. I'm going to run a bead of glue all the way around the inside of the skin. Now that I've got my bead of glue, I want to make sure XM is at the bottom near the seam. Okay, I'm going to flip it upside down. Press down gently on the formers, and that should give me a flush fit. Yeah, it looks good. Be sure and give this plenty of time to cool down. Once you get to the portion of your build where you have your wooden XM mount, I would recommend taking whatever pieces are forward of the mount and pushing them off to the side until the very end of the build. Without having support by the former, those pieces get damaged very easily. I always make adding the pieces in front of the XM mount the very last step whenever I do a build. This is a really good time to add the accessory box to our nose. Using the backside of a razor blade, I'm going to go down all the scores so we can remove foam wherever indicated. Once our foam's been removed, looks like I'm going to be doing a B fold and a B fold. I'll do that now. Let that cool down a minute, and then we'll do our test fit into the nose. Once the glue's cooled down, let's do a test fit. Okay, it looks good. I'm going to pull my box out. I'm going to apply a bead of glue to the front of the accessory box. I'm going to run it back in. You're going to want to run your box all the way down until it bottoms out on the X mount. Once that's done, we'll run a bead of glue on the side and the other side. You can also run a bead of glue down here where it's really thin. We'll give that a chance to cool down, and then we're going to finish things up. As I mentioned earlier, I would normally wait until I'm done with the aircraft before I add the skins in front of the XM mount, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and do it now. If you look here, we're going to be peeling the paper. This is going to be a glue and wrap fit, and we're going to begin gluing here. We'll begin by removing paper and adding some shape. Test fit looks good. I'm going to add about an inch of glue right across the crop mark there at the top. And once again, always remember to shingle over the part you are gluing to. Once that's cooled down, let's begin to make our way around. do the same on the other side. As I do my test fit, it looks like I've got a little bit of interference, so I'm going to add a little bit of a bevel right here. I'm also going to tear off a piece of tape. When I bring my two edges together, I'm going to run a piece of tape across the seam. I'm going to flip it over, push the tip of my glue gun down between the two edges, and put a bead of glue. So if we look at our next skin, it's going to go on the same way as the previous. The only difference is we see we've got a bevel start and a bevel stop. So we're going to add a small bevel to the outer edge once we remove the paper. Once we've got our bevel added, I'm going to carefully add a little bit of shape. Now we're going to flip the part over and look for the arrow. This will tell us where we need to begin the glue and wrap process. Test fit looks good. I'm going to add a bead of glue, a little over 1 inch long. Just like before, you can see where I'm shingling over just slightly, making sure my crop marks are lined up. I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2 minutes. I want to make sure that this part isn't going anywhere before I move on. Once the center's cooled, I'm going to work my way around just like I did on the last piece. Once that's cooled down, let's do exactly the same thing on the last piece. After we peel our paper, we're going to add a bevel. Once the bevel's done, I'm going to add some shape. And when I flip it over, I see that my arrow is top center, just like the last piece. My fit isn't bad, but it looks like I'm going to need to add a little bit more of a bevel. That looks good. Now I'm going to continue to work my way around. As you can see, the examples we did were quite a bit different from one another, but as long as you're following the symbol mapping, construction of noses, regardless of the shape, are a piece of cake. Now that we've covered noses, let's move on to something else.